Now, in your textbook, as well as in the series of handouts for this unit, there are diagrams for the soil textural triangle. And I want to take a minute at this point in time to go through and show you how that textural triangle is built and then how we read or interpret textural class names if we know the percentages of sand, silt, and clay. Here we have the soil textural triangle. This triangle is composed of 3 different axes. Of course, if we have silt, sand, and clay-sized particles, we must have an axis on this triangle for each of these particular soil separates. The sand axis is on the bottom portion of the triangle. Starting at this lower right-hand corner represents 0% sand, running across to 100% sand at the lower left-hand corner of the triangle. If, for example, we had 20% sand-sized particles, the 20% line for sand runs from this point on the bottom axis of the triangle. I'm tracking that line up through the triangle, so anything that has 20% sand is going to fall somewhere on this line, from here down to the base where 20% sand is represented on the bottom axis. If we have a known percentage of silt, we're going to read silt starting at 0% at the very top tip of the triangle. It runs down to 100% at the lower right-hand corner. So if we had 20% silt-sized particles in a particular soil sample, we would be reading the silt somewhere along this line as we go down the triangle. The final axis on the soil textural triangle is the percent of clay. Percent of clay starts at the lower left-hand corner being 0%, and it runs up the left-hand side of the triangle to 100% up here at the top or apex again. So if we use that same number of 20% clay-sized particles, we know that that soil will fall somewhere on this line that runs across here from 20% on this left-hand side over to where that line intersects on the right-hand side over here. We're going to be somewhere along that line if we have a soil with 20% clay-sized particles. Now you'll notice that the other portion of this triangle, other than the 3 axes and the lines that represent the percentage of sand, silt, and clay, are a number of boxes that are drawn in. There are some lines placed here on the triangle. And these lines are to separate out what we call the textural class names for the soil. If that soil percentage of sand, silt, and clay falls anywhere within this upper portion of the triangle, these are the delineating lines on the triangle itself, that soil would be called a clay soil. So clay would be the textural class name of that soil. If we had a soil, let's say for example, that was a silt loam, well, silt loam is delineated here on this portion of the triangle. Anything falling inside of the box, the lines of which I'm tracing now, so this box right in here is called a silt loam soil. So you see that if you have a very, very high percentage of one of the textural separates, clay for example, that will be the textural class name for the soil. If you have an extremely high percentage of silt, we have one little box over here in the lower right-hand corner for soils that are classified textural-wise as being silt. And the same would hold true for the sand. If we had an extremely high proportion of sand, we have one little box over here in the lower left-hand corner of the triangle that would be for those soils that are considered to be a sand textural class. Now, if we look at this for just a minute, we can see that it's going to take something more than 80% sand to fit into the textural class name of sand. Now, even though we have a soil that appears to be extremely coarse and very, very high in sand, usually those soils, if they're being used agriculturally especially, are going to fit into the loamy sand or the sandy loam category. They may have 60, 70% or even 75% sand. They're not going to be textural class of sand. They'll either be sandy loams or loamy sands. So to say that a soil is straight sand or straight silt or straight clay, what we're really saying there is these soils have a very great amount of their physical properties influenced by either sand, silt, or clay. But I think you can see from where those boxes occur on the triangle and the size of them that very few soils are going to be just silt or just sand as a textural class name. So where are a high percentage of our soils likely to fall? They're likely to fall in the silt loam, sandy clay loams, silty clay loams, and sandy clays. In other words, out here in the middle of this textural triangle. So once we know any two of the three percentages for the soil separates, sand, silt, or clay, we are then able to go to the soil textural triangle and determine the textural class name for the soil. Let's take an example here. Let's say that we did a soil textural analysis in the lab, and in that textural analysis we found a soil that had a silt percentage of 25 and a clay percentage of 25%. Well, you'll notice that these lines, be those silt, sand, or clay, are broken into even numbers, 10, 20, 30. So we have to interpolate or basically figure out what's about halfway between 20 and 30 for 25% and follow that axis down, being parallel between these two lines of 20 and 30%. So in that example that I just gave you, we said we had 25% silt and 25% clay. Well, obviously, if we have 25% of both silt and clay, then that means that the sand percentage must be 50%. So we could use any two of those three numbers, the 25% for silt, the 25% for clay, or the 50% for sand. Any two of those should bring us to the same point on the triangle. So let's take the first two numbers, 25% silt. We're reading silt on this axis from 0 here to 100 at the bottom. So 25 is halfway in between. We read down here to where it intersects with 25% clay. Here's 20% and here's 30% clay, so we're coming across to this line, and you can see that 25% of clay and 25% of silt is going to fall approximately there or over in the lower right-hand portion of the sandy clay loam category. And we can check that by coming up on the 50% sand line. You can see the 50% sand line is going to fall right in there also. So about right there is where that soil would fall on the textural triangle. We would look at these corresponding textural class name. It's a sandy clay loam soil. So with those three numbers, we would be able to determine that this soil is a sandy clay loam in terms of textural class.